The outbreak of the Second World War found Nazi Germany with much the same kinds of problems at sea that Imperial Germany had faced during the 1914 to 1918 conflict. Great Britain, building on a lengthy naval tradition, had undoubted naval supremacy. The geographical positioning of the two countries favoured the British. If Germany was to meet its expansionist objectives, it would have to challenge the Royal Navy. There were many ways of doing this, but the obvious one was to build up a large surface fleet themselves. It was partly this building up of a powerful naval force that had increased the tensions between the two nations prior to the First World War. During the 30s, a new surface fleet was constructed to replace the ships that had been scuttled at Scapa Flow, and to once more challenge the British at sea. On the last day of 1942, strong elements of this vaunted force, on which so many resources had been lavished, suffered a humiliating defeat at the hands of a Royal Navy squadron that was vastly its inferior in firepower. It was a major watershed in the war at sea, ending forever the grandiose ambitions of Germany's surface fleet. The defeat was the culmination of several ongoing factors that were affecting the German Navy. At the most fundamental level, heavily armoured and expensive gun-armed surface ships were in long-term decline. Increasingly, air power was becoming the dominant factor at sea. Secondly, German morale was slowly being rotted away by years trapped in harbours by the numerically superior British fleet. Thirdly, it had been expected that individual raiders would be able to infiltrate out into the Atlantic from the Baltic with an acceptable level of risk. In fact, it proved enormously difficult to run surface ships through the narrow northern waters, which both sides riddled with mines and ceaselessly patrolled with aircraft. Most important of all was the fear of torpedo attacks. In the early years of the war, British destroyers had shown they were prepared to take almost suicidal risks in engaging large German warships. A prime example was HMS Glowworm's heroic ramming attack during the Norway campaign. The Kriegsmarine was acutely aware that a single torpedo could cripple even the largest ship, and that any such injured vessel could then be picked off at leisure by British reinforcements that the German Navy could never hope to match in numbers. Then there was the morale effect of a lost sea battle. Large surface ships had a high profile, they were very visible, and the loss of one had a correspondingly high effect both at home and abroad. This had been amply demonstrated at the Battle of the River Plate and the chase for the Bismarck, and the Third Reich was in no hurry to repeat either of those experiences. Paradoxically, the Germans invested so much into the capital ships that they had essentially become too valuable to risk, and thus ineffective. All in all, it could be argued that psychologically the Kriegsmarine's surface fleet was already a spent force, but materially it still had the potential to inflict serious damage, and the chance was to come with the Arctic convoys. The Arctic convoys were started because the Russians were in dire strait on the Eastern Front. Huge areas of the Ukraine and the Caucasus had been overrun by the Germans. Moscow was threatened, Leningrad besieged. Stalin demanded assistance from his allies, and under this pressure Churchill agreed to send supplies. The best route was by the Middle East, but for political reasons the Russians were loath to admit the British into Iraq. The only alternative was to run convoys through the Arctic Sea, an immense distance within easy reach of German-occupied North Norway. The unique characteristics of the area both helped and hindered possible surface ship sorties. Weather conditions were bad all through the year and positively appalling in winter. Sea mists, squalls and short days reduced visibility to sometimes less than 2 miles, point blank for naval guns of the time. A ship's survival could depend on recognising an enemy a few split seconds before being positively identified itself. Temperatures could reach -15 degrees centigrade, the sea so cold that spray frequently froze on contact with the deck of a ship. The harsh conditions tested both men and machinery to their limits. The weather frequently dispersed convoys and produced easy-to-pick-off stragglers. The outward-bound Arctic convoys were designated by the letters PQ, and the return convoys by the letters QP. PQ-1 sailed for Archangel on September 28, 1941. It was the first of 40 Arctic convoys run right up to the end of the war. It arrived safely and without incident 13 days later. Indeed, the Axis was remarkably slow to react to the Arctic convoys, and the first dozen or so were hardly molested. By January 1942, however, the increasingly paranoid Hitler, beset on all sides by the rapidly expanding armies of his enemies, had become convinced that an Allied invasion of Norway was imminent. He feared an Anglo-American link-up with the Russians. The resultant pressure might persuade Sweden to join the Allied cause, which would outflank the Finnish front. His obsession was fed by Allied diplomatic efforts in Stockholm and by increasingly successful British commando raids on the Norwegian coast. Unwilling to commit ever more of his increasingly scarce troops to Norway, Hitler decided to use the Luftwaffe and the Kriegsmarine to counter the perceived threat. Specialist anti-shipping aircraft were stationed at air bases in North Norway, and submarines were redeployed from the Atlantic into the North Cape area. More significantly, the pocket battleships Scharnhorst and Gneisenauer, with the heavy cruiser Prince Eugen, sailed from Brest and in the daring Operation Cerberus returned to the Baltic Sea via the English Channel, the so-called Channel Dash. The Commander-in-Chief of the German Kriegsmarine, Admiral Raeder, strongly disapproved of these measures. He was of the opinion, subsequently justified, that the Allies would launch their counterattack in North Africa, not in Norway. The heavy concentration of force did however enable the Germans to severely maul Convoy PQ-17 in June of 1942. Spurred by this success, and with the fuel situation improving, Raeder planned an even greater strike on PQ-18 using the surface fleet. It would be an opportunity to justify its existence. Hitler knew that a surface attack would be opposed, and feared the effect losing another naval battle would have on both German prestige and morale. At the last moment he vetoed the sailing of the big ships. Raeder had to leave PQ-18 to the Luftwaffe and to the U-boats, which together very satisfactorily sank 13 of the convoy's 40 merchants. After PQ-18, the North African landings started, and with the demands for merchant shipping that this operation entailed, the Allies were forced to temporarily suspend the Arctic convoys. The resumption of the convoys in December was greeted with deep misgivings by British naval strategists. Admiral Tovey, the C&C of the Home Fleet, was particularly concerned. In the face of the German build-up in North Norway, it was proving difficult to provide sufficient escorts for the Murmansk runs. There simply were not enough cruisers and destroyers to escort Arctic convoys, guard the western approaches, and prosecute the Battle of the Atlantic. The Germans had already shown what damage they could do with just U-boats and aircraft. With their surface fleet now potentially adding its weight, the British would have to deploy capital ships of their own in order to counter a possible sortie. But keeping battleships at sea was expensive. In the confined areas of the Arctic seas they would be vulnerable to air and submarine attack, and even more escorts would have to be found to provide a screen for them. Furthermore, it was now winter, and the spread of the ice edge southwards forced convoys to take routes much closer to the German bases. In short, the whole concept of running supplies to Russia by sea was becoming strategically unsound, but for political reasons they had to continue. By this time the designation of the outward-bound convoys had been altered from PQ to JW, and the homeward-bound ones from QP to RA. The next Russia-bound convoy was to be JW-51. Tovey argued desperately and successfully for this large group to be split into two, on the grounds that there was no safety to be had in numbers in the face of a surface attack. Accordingly, JW-51A of 16 merchant vessels sailed from Loch Ewe in Scotland on December the 15th, arriving without incident at the Kola Inlet a week and a half later. JW-51B of 14 merchant vessels was to sail from Scotland on December the 22nd. The first of the return convoys, RA-51, was to sail from Murmansk on December 30th, using the escorts from JW-51A. The Germans decided to target the outward-bound JW-51B. A comparatively small convoy, JW-51B had three sets of escorts. Firstly, there was a distant covering force operating out of Akureyri in Iceland under the command of Vice Admiral Sir Bruce Fraser, consisting of the battleship Anson, cruiser Cumberland, and 3 destroyers. This would only provide cover at long range, and only then for the first part of the voyage. Secondly, there was a support force, specially formed by Tovey, whose job was to trail convoys and intervene if German surface units attacked. Called Force R, it consisted of the cruisers Jamaica and Sheffield under the command of Rear Admiral Burnett, a veteran of the summer convoy battles. They were instructed to keep at least 50 miles from the coast in order to minimise the risk of air attack. Finally, there was the close escort group which sailed with the convoy, and thus formed the most immediate force that the Germans would have to contend with. Initially consisted of only 8 small vessels, but the 3 small Hunt-class escort destroyers of this group were to be replaced at sea by the 6 large fleet destroyers of the 17th Flotilla under Captain R. Sherbrooke. Sherbrooke was an experienced officer, but he had been in command of the 17th Flotilla for only 4 weeks. However, he quickly built up a rapport with the entire force. He well realised the danger of surface attack and formulated a planned defence. On spotting a German surface raider, one of his destroyers, the Akates, the only A-class, was to lay a smokescreen to hide the merchant vessels. The other, larger O-class destroyers would speed to interpose themselves, and the minor escorts would close upon the convoy itself. These tactics were extensively practised during the early part of the voyage. The first part of the operation went according to plan for JW-51B. The swap over of destroyers was effected without incident just east of Ireland, and good time was made. Then, 6 days into the voyage, the weather intervened. A fierce gale blew up, and in the heavy seas and ferocious snow squalls, the 5 merchant ships of the port column lost contact with the rest of the convoy. The destroyer Oribe suffered a gyro compass failure, also lost contact, and eventually sailed on to Russia alone. More importantly, the storm drove the convoy behind schedule and south of its intended route, bringing it close to the German base at Altenfjord. This was to have profound consequences, the most serious of which from the British side was that the gale missed Force R, which was therefore unaware of the deviation of course of the convoy and was still expecting to rendezvous with it southwest of Bear Island. The next day, 29th of December, the minesweeper Bramble was detached to make a radar search for the missing ships, 3 of which almost immediately regained contact. The trawler Visalma, which had also been separated by the ferocious gales, fell in with another of the merchant ships, the Chester Valley. Together they actually succeeded in overtaking the convoy while trying to catch it up, reaching Russia ahead of schedule. Because of all these delays, it was not until December the 30th that the convoy turned fully east. The German submarine U-234 made contact and shadowed for nearly 8 hours, sending constant positional reports, before she was spotted and nearly rammed by the Obdurate. Sherbrooke now knew he had been spotted. More worryingly, he had received a signal from London informing him that German radio traffic on the Norwegian coast had increased markedly, which was compatible with an imminent movement of large ships. Indeed, with the convoy's position supplied by U-234, at 1800 that night a German strike force sailed from Altenfjord under the command of Admiral Kummetz. The force they adopted a course slanted to the northwest that avoided waiting British submarines. Kummetz's orders were to avoid a superior force, otherwise destroy according to tactical situation, a rather vague instruction open to wide interpretation. He was also under orders not to waste time by picking up survivors of any ships he sank, or even, gruesomely enough, to allow survivors to be picked up by Allied ships. For operational reasons, his flotilla was now in close company, but in fact they were soon to be divided into 2 separate forces. The northern force, under his direct command, consisted of the heavy cruiser Admiral Hipper and the destroyers Friedrich Etholt, Richard Beitstein and Z-29. The southern force, under Stanger, consisted of the pocket battleship Lutzow, the destroyers Theodor Riedel, Z-30 and Z-31. All the German destroyers were of the formidable Mars class, considerably larger and more powerful than their British counterparts. Kummetz's plan for the forthcoming engagement could be described as the most cautious way of being bold. It reflected the immense fear the Germans had of risking any big ship, and yet still enabled them to take offensive action. The flotilla was to split at about 8 o'clock, and the 2 forces to operate approximately 75 miles apart. Hipper's group was to lead off to the north, while the Lutzow group moved eastwards. Each group was to string its destroyers ahead in a line 15 miles long, straddling the convoy's anticipated route. Once the convoy was located, Hipper would attack from the north, draw off the escorts and drive the merchant ships onto Lutzow in the south. The departure time and speed of the flotilla were carefully set so that interception would take place in the forenoon, when there were the only few hours of good light in the Arctic winter. It was a good plan, and if pressed energetically enough could have done serious damage to JW-51B, but the Kriegsmarine was to be shackled by caution and operational constraints. 1 hour after sailing, at Hitler's insistence, another directive signal was passed to Kummetz. It warned him to exercise caution against an enemy of equal strength. Certainly losing another large surface warship at this stage in the war would have been politically damaging to the Third Reich, but this order was almost impossible to interpret. What, after all, constitutes an enemy of equal strength? One thing Kummetz could be sure of was that the main thrust of these orders. He determined to take no risks at all. Meanwhile, Force R had arrived at a position north of the Coal Inlet and had turned to pass astern of JW-51B. Burnett cunningly intended to station himself to the north of the convoy, where he'd be further away from the German air bases, and yet still able to run down to intercept any surface force. Because of the low position of the sun in these northern latitudes, Force R would also be able to see any ships to the south long before they could be seen themselves. Unfortunately, due to the need to keep radio silence, Burnett was still unaware the convoy was 30 miles south and 60 miles west of where he thought it was. By 31st December the storm had completely broken, but there were still occasional snow squalls and the sky was completely overcast. Visibility was 10 miles looking south, but only 7 looking north. Moreover, the temperature was dropping rapidly. Both Burnett and Sherbrooke had plenty to think about. During the night, a British radio monitoring station had detected a German destroyer off North Cape and 2 submarines, one ahead of the convoy and one to the south. At 07:15, Hipper was still steaming northeast at high speed when a lookout spotted 2 silhouettes 60 degrees ahead. Cummets immediately turned towards them to reduce the silhouette of his own ships, and ordered the destroyer Eckholt to investigate. At this point, although he didn't know it, it was about 20 miles astern of the convoy. Half an hour passed without word, so Cummets ordered Hipper to slow to 10 knots and turn east. By now he could make out more and larger vessels in the gloom, and it must have come as no surprise when at 07:53 German destroyers finally signalled that they had positively identified the convoy and that they were now shadowing. The convoy was further south than he had anticipated, but nonetheless Cummets decided to continue his original plan. At 0800 he ordered Hipper to increase speed to 20 knots and turn north again, in order to catch up with JW51B by first light. By doing this, however, he lost touch with his destroyers. These appeared to split into their assigned groups, although the order to do so had not yet been given. This early dispersal of force was to cause problems for the Germans later on. By 0830 the situation was this. JW51B was over 200 miles northwest of the Kola Inlet and was steering east at 8 knots. Burnett's Force R was 30 miles further north but was heading northwest away from the convoy. Visalma and Chester Valley were about 15 miles north of Force R and heading east. Bramble was about 15 miles off the convoy's port quarter and was also heading east. Hipper was off the convoy's port quarter, and the Lutzow group was now off its starboard beam. None of these groups were completely sure of the position of any of the others, or in some cases of their very existence. At around 0845 the convoy's lead ship, the corvette Hyderabad, spotted 2 destroyers to the south moving on a reverse parallel course. An earlier signal to the effect that Russian aircraft might be joining the convoy had been misread by the corvette as Russian destroyers. Hyderabad therefore sent no signal to Sherbrooke on the dubious grounds that the vessels were probably Russian. Fortunately, a few minutes later, Obdurate sighted these same ships turning north, and upon signalling their presence to Sherbrooke, was ordered to investigate. The targets, now 3 in number, immediately turned away, and it was some time before Obdurate could get into a position to send a challenge. At the same time, Force R picked up 2 targets on radar, one large and one small, just over 7 miles ahead. Suspecting they might be German surface units, Burnett increased speed and tracked them. The 2 were in fact Visalma and Chester Valley. This was a very dangerous development for the British, as Force R was effectively being drawn even further north of the convoy. At 09:15, Obdurate finally drew to within 4 miles of the 3 unidentified targets, close enough for a challenge to be visible. There was no reply, although this would not have been unusual if the targets had indeed been Russian. However, one of the 3, actually Hipper's destroyer group, then opened fire on Obdurate, revealing her identity. The reflections from the gun flashes were seen by Force R, causing much confusion. If the ships they were tracking were German, why was there firing to the south? Sherbrooke, however, had no such reservations. He flashed an enemy contact on fleet waves, and the convoy's close escort moved smoothly into their positions for repelling surface attacks. The O-class destroyers placed themselves between the convoy and the surface threat, the other escorts closed up, and the destroyer Aceh started laying a smokescreen to obscure the merchant ships. Cummets now paid the price for losing contact with his destroyers earlier. Not being sure where they were, he was unable to tell which of the many ships he could see was hostile, even though the light was improving. It was only when Aceh began laying smoke that he could definitely identify her as a target, as he knew no German destroyer would lay smoke in this situation. Accordingly, Cummets gave permission to open fire on her, the same time signalling Lutzow that he was in action with a convoy escort. The German cruiser turned to unmask her rear turrets and thus increase her firepower, but this presented her large beam silhouette to the approaching British destroyers and allowed them to make a positive identification. They immediately attacked. Hipper had fired several salvos before a German lookout spotted a destroyer, Onslow, approaching, then soon after another, Orwell. Remembering his orders and fearful of torpedoes, Cummets promptly turned Hipper about so that her stern, the smallest target, was facing the approaching destroyers, and then fired on Onslow using radar. Sherbrooke had previously told his captains that German capital ships would probably be frightened off by threatening a torpedo attack, even though scoring a hit would be extremely unlikely in these conditions, except at suicidally short ranges. This was especially true of Cummets, who was a torpedo specialist and was therefore particularly aware of the threat they posed. In this case, his obsession was further fed by a faulty lookout report that Onslow had actually launched torpedoes when she had not. In any event, Hipper's defensive action also turned her away from the convoy, which was all that Sherbrooke had intended. Meanwhile, the firing of the big 8-inch guns threw an even bigger reflection to Force R, and Burnett slowly began to realise the true situation. However, the two contacts to the north were still worrying him, and it was some time before he came to the decision that the shooting to the south was too heavy to be ignored. Once he had decided to sail to the sound of the guns, Burnett quickly worked Force R up to 31 knots. By 09:55, Obedient caught up with Orwell and Onslow. Hipper was starting to head back towards the convoy, firing at the destroyers blocking the way. The British ships gamely fired back, but it was fear of torpedoes that caused Cummets to turn away again at 1000 hours. At 10:04, Hipper made a third advance and turn away, continuing with the plan to attempt to attract more of the escorts so that Lutzow could get a free run at the convoy. By this time the German destroyers had disappeared out of sight of Sherbrooke, and fearing that they might be working around him, the escort commander ordered Obedient and Obdurate to rejoin the convoy. This was the first inkling the British had of the German battle plan to lure the escorts away. Sherbrooke's suspicions were further aroused when he received a signal from Burnett: "I'm approaching you on a course of 170, which made it clear that Force R was to his north and not to the south as he had believed. What if another German force was waiting to the south instead? And of course there was. At the very moment Sherbrooke was deliberating, the Lutzow was crossing the path of the now virtually defenceless convoy, having steered slowly northeast for the past hour. Obedient and Obdurate had had no time to get into position to interfere. Cummets' plan had worked. But visibility was still extremely poor. Although Lutzow spotted several targets through the snow squalls, some of them as little as 3 miles away, Capitan Stanger refused to engage any of them because he felt it was impossible to make positive identifications. Thus the Germans missed their best chance to inflict heavy damage on the convoy. Unaware of Stanger's vacillation, Cummets continued his efforts to draw off the escort. Hipper's destroyers had now rejoined, and at 10:14 the four ships together made a concerted attack. At 10:19 an 8-inch shell landed abaft Onslow's bridge, ripped open the funnel and knocked out the radar and most of the radio aerials. Sherbrooke himself was hit by a splinter which smashed the left side of his face and his nose, leaving his left eye dangling down his cheek. In spite of the injury, he continued to give orders calmly without a change in the tone of his voice, and it was some minutes before another officer, finding blood on his own uniform, turned and realised that the captain was badly wounded. Almost immediately afterwards, 2 more 8-inch shells landed on Onslow's foredeck, wrecking both of the forward guns. Sherbrooke was forced to cut speed in order to control the resultant cordite fires. Realising that his ship was now incapable of continuing the fight, he turned her away behind a smoke screen and headed back to the convoy. It was only then that the captain agreed to have his wound dressed. With Sherbrooke badly injured and Onslow damaged, command of the convoy escort passed to Captain Kinloch in Obedient. Hipper had turned her attention to the Orwell, whose captain was in 2 minds as to whether to cover Onslow or attack Hipper independently. Before he could make the decision, Kinloch gathered up Obdurate and moved to reinforce the threatened flank. Cummets, unaware of the crippling blows he had struck, turned away again into a snow squall at 31 knots, convinced that the convoy must now run onto the Lutzow group. The weather was worsening. Visibility was now down to only 2 miles. At 10:30, Sheffield's radar picked up a large ship about 12 miles ahead, Hipper, and a few minutes later another 15 miles away on the port bow, Lutzow. Barents was now convinced that these were German heavy units and decided to attack the nearer vessel. He set off in pursuit at once, but he had no speed advantage over Hipper. It would be some time yet before his cruisers could intervene. His intended target, Hipper, was steering east-northeast at high speed in an attempt to cut across the convoy and make another attack. As the cruiser manoeuvred, a single ship emerged from the gloom ahead of her. It was the hapless Bramble, which had been searching for the merchant vessels scattered during the storm. The big German cruiser quickly disabled her with a few well-placed shots. Ordering Escort to finish the luckless minesweeper off, Hipper then turned again towards the convoy. At 10:45, Sheffield glimpsed Hipper in the gloom about 10 miles off. By now the entire convoy had turned south and was heading straight towards Lutzow. Obedient and Obdurate were astern, keeping between the convoy and Hipper. Orwell was somewhat off to the east and was desperately trying to join them. Achates was still faithfully laying a smokescreen, and Onslow was trying to reach the head of the convoy to home Force R by radio. Thus the Lutzow group were now only 2 to 3 miles from the convoy, and there were no escorts in between other than 2 small corvettes. Instead of engaging, however, Captain Stanger slowed Lutzow down and steamed ahead of the convoy, refusing to open fire because of poor visibility. When firing was heard to the north, Lutzow did turn west to investigate, but even when 2 British destroyers were sighted off the port's bow, Stanger refused to engage them. Instead he increased speed to 24 knots and drew off, again blaming the terrible weather conditions. Hipper was now pursuing the convoy and concentrating her fire on Achates, which was soon heavily damaged. Struck by several 8-inch shells which killed or wounded all the bridge crew and badly hauled the ship forward, Achates lost speed and began to founder. Obedient, Orwell and Obdurate intervened, and Hipper switched fire to them, wrecking Obedient's radios. Fear of torpedo attack soon forced Hipper away to the north again, however, and in so doing she ran straight into Force R. At 11:36, Hipper signalled Lutzow. In action with escorting forces, no cruiser with convoy. Almost immediately 24 6-inch shells landed around her. At 8 miles, Hipper was fully visible to Jamaica and Sheffield, which being further to the north were themselves still hidden in the darkness. Barents' cruisers had achieved complete surprise. They managed to get off 4 salvos before Hipper could even return their fire. Such was the unexpected fury of the attack that Cummets immediately made a general signal to break off the action and to retire to the west, but the Germans were not to escape unscathed. A shell from Jamaica's 4th salvo hit Hipper on the port bow, knocking out her No. 3 boiler and reducing her speed to 23 knots. Both British cruisers scored a hit with their 5th salvo, setting fire to Hipper's aircraft hangar. The hapless German cruiser turned a full circle to starboard, obscuring herself in smoke, some of it laid by her own destroyers. Jamaica and Sheffield closed in, and by 11:43 both sides were heading south. Suddenly 2 German destroyers appeared out of the gloom on Sheffield's port bow. Thinking they were about to launch a torpedo attack, Sheffield quickly swung beam onto them in order to make herself a more difficult target. She needn't have worried. In the confusion, Eckholt had mistook Sheffield for Hipper and had steered straight for her, followed by the Beitzen. Sheffield cut loose at the destroyer with every gun she had at point-blank range. Hit by some 7 salvos, Eckholt capsized and sank. Jamaica engaged the Beitzen, which managed to escape. This tragic diversion allowed Hipper to pull ahead of her pursuers and turn west at full speed. Force R resumed the chase, but when Beitzen and Z-29 were spotted 4 miles away, they were engaged instead. Then the Lutzow appeared, and the guns of the British cruisers again shifted target. The big pocket battleship had all this time been prowling to the east of the convoy. She had fired briefly at a merchantman, the Caloba, damaging her slightly. The British destroyers had promptly hurried to the east of the convoy and begun laying smoke. Lutzow then switched her fire to the destroyers, damaging Obdurate with a near miss. Now she and Force R traded shots. The advantage that the German ship's heavy calibre guns gave was largely nullified by some very scrappy shooting, but then Hipper came into sight. With both her and Lutzow shooting at Force R, Barents found himself caught between 2 fires and was obliged to disengage to the north. By 12:36 all firing had ceased, although Force R pursued the Germans towards Altenford until 1400, when Barents turned to rejoin the convoy. The last sighting was by the British submarine Graf, which spotted Hipper at 1300 on January 1st just north of Altenford. The cruiser was too far away to be engaged, but the Graf, a captured German U-boat commissioned to the Royal Navy, hung on. 3 hours later her patience was rewarded when she spotted 2 of the German destroyers, one towing the other. She made an attack, but without any success. Kmetz's plan had actually worked quite well, in spite of several tactical errors. The indecisiveness of Stanger, however, robbed the Germans of the fruits of their endeavours. Behind it all was a stultifying reluctance to take risks. The outcome of the Battle of the Barents Sea had considerable political repercussions, including a major shake-up in the German naval hierarchy. Hitler was furious when he heard of the defeat, particularly as the need to maintain radio silence meant that an accurate report from Norway arrived 24 hours after a Reuters press statement. In a fit of rage, he actually gave the order to pay off all warships bigger than a destroyer. The Führer's main complaint was that the capital ships lacked fighting spirit, the navy was too careful in husbanding them, and overanalysed the odds of engagement. It was a very curious attitude to take, as the main reason for the defeat was Hitler's own insistence that the big ships should not be risked. The commander-in-chief of the Kriegsmarine, Admiral Raeder, felt compelled to tender his resignation in protest. Hitler attempted to mollify him, but the admiral was adamant. It is probable that Raeder was finding the task of running the Kriegsmarine, in the face of the Führer's ignorance of naval strategy, beyond his powers anyway, and was looking for an excuse to resign. His successor was Admiral Dönitz, the CNC of U-boats. Dönitz was a major proponent of light forces, especially U-boats, as being the premier naval weapon for Germany against the might of the Royal Navy. Even he balked at the decision to scrap the major surface combatants, however, and eventually talked Hitler around to giving some of them a reprieve. Even so, Hitler was quite badly damaged in the action, and though repaired, was never used in an operational capacity again. On the British side, all the merchant vessels safely docked to the Kola Inlet on January 3rd, delivering nearly 100,000 tons of supplies, including 120 aircraft, 200 tanks, 2,000 other vehicles, and 24,000 tons of oil. The Battered of Chates did finally sink, though all the surviving crew were safely transferred to Northern Gem. There were no survivors from the unlucky minesweeper Bramble. Admiral Tovey described the Battle of the Barents Sea as one of the finest examples in either of the two world wars of how to handle cruisers and destroyers in action with heavier forces. The British had every right to be pleased with their success. Their ships were smaller and far less firepower than the German flotilla. Undoubtedly a major factor in the British victory at Barents Sea was Sherbrooke's excellent leadership. His responses to the attacks were swift and decisive. He fully realised the fears of the Germans and played upon them continually. Sherbrooke's gallant handling of the close escort and his refusal to leave the bridge when badly wounded subsequently earned him Britain's highest award for gallantry, the Victoria Cross. There only remains the matter of the elements. Certainly the appalling weather conditions worked to the advantage of the British. Poor visibility made it difficult for the German commanders to make full use of their superior resources. It also enabled the escorting destroyers to close more easily, particularly important as the Germans were under such strict orders to avoid losses. The British won the Battle of the Barents Sea long before it was fought, by instilling a defensive attitude into the minds of their opponents. Even when the convoy was at their mercy, the Germans expected difficulties, and delayed their moves long enough for Force R to deliver those difficulties.